Welcome to today's webinar, From For People to With People, Creating Equitable and Resilient Places. I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. We're going to start off today with an interactive activity. We're going to show you a photo, and in the chat box, tell us in a few words, what is going on in this picture? I will harvest this response and later I will report back. I love this picture. There's so much going on in here. The pandemic is challenging not only to our physical, mental, and economic health, but also our social health. Lockdowns have shifted our daily routines and impacted our access to public spaces. Outdoor gathering spaces like parks and farmers markets are being redesigned to meet the new public health guidelines. Indoor gathering spaces like libraries and community centers and places of worship have closed to prevent the transmission of the virus. Placemaking practitioners around the world are highlighting how public spaces can provide the foundations for recovery. Placemaking has the potential to unify and bring people together as we emerge from this pandemic. By shifting the way public spaces are governed to a more community-driven and bottom-up approach, we can create community hubs that foster the social connections and resilience we all need. Today's webinar is about transforming the architecture, urban design, and planning towards the practice of creating resilient and equitable places. Requires us to move beyond expert culture and towards celebrating everybody's contribution, moving from for people to with people. During COVID, many communities have demonstrated the leadership capacity to stay resilient using or improving their social networks. These communities have started refining their spaces to be more inclusive and responsive to their needs. This has created a promising ground for a systems change in our sector to incorporate the bottom-up approach and into the current top-down approach decision-making and governance process. We are joined by Open Architecture Collaborative Canada board members as they share their stories, challenges, and opportunities in implementing impact and equity lens to advocate for this systems change. We're then going to have a great discussion with some amazing panelists as we touch on the sector's systemic issues and explore the avenue and barriers for this system change. In particular, the whole decision-making and governance process, reattributing these roles and project financing. This webinar is brought to you by our Neighbourhood Learning Community of Practice. And I'd like to welcome the Open Architecture Collaborative Canada, and I'm going to pass it over to Nagar.
Thank you, Heather. And hello, everyone. My name is Nagar. I'm part of the team at Open Architecture Collaborative Canada, and we are very excited to be with all of you today. And we would like to start with a true story. Story of Little Jamaica, a neighborhood located just west of Toronto's Midtown core along Eglinton Avenue. For over 40 years, this neighborhood has been a distinct ethnic and cultural hub for Toronto's Caribbean and African immigrants. And it used to be filled with scenes and the spirit of the homeland. But those lively streets now look like this. Demographic change, gentrification, and on top of that, the disruptive construction of a new LRT line have dramatically impacted the livelihood of the local and particularly the Black community. And to make the situation even more concerning, as part of a plan for future development along Eglinton Avenue, the City of Toronto has conducted a planning framework study called Eglinton Connects. This plan provides recommendations to guide the city's policies for the revitalization of the area over time. But although it took the city 2 years to provide this framework, and although They involved more than 60 consultation events and reached out to over 5,000 people. The Black community and local Black businesses in particular were left out of this community engagement process. And they did not get a say in a process that would shape their neighborhood and their built environment, all the spaces in which they would live, work, socialize, and recreate on a daily basis. And unfortunately, what has happened in Little Jamaica is not unique to this neighborhood. This is happening every day in many neighborhoods in Toronto and in all our cities across the country. People, especially those who are historically underrepresented, are being left out of the process that is deciding how our cities should and would look like in the future. And now we are left with inequitable built environments that are negatively impacting the well-being and livelihood of our communities nationwide.
And this impact is not only about gentrification or displacement and health crisis. The numbers of those areas are already so shocking. In 2018, more than 1.6 million Canadian households in Canada had to live in an unsuitable or inadequate or unaffordable dwelling. But when it comes to the impact of built environment on our equitable well-being, the story goes deeper and further. Look at some of these shocking figures. The way we design our cities and neighborhoods play a significant but hidden role in creating all of these numbers. Current planning and urban policies have taken away those spaces that allow us to bump to each other, to interact with our neighbors, groceries, bakeries, and has become a key driver for social isolation and forgetting the neighboring. It also lets mega markets swallow all local food suppliers and create areas which is called food deserts. In Ontario, neighborhoods with low income profile, apparently they have seriously impacted by the presence of these food deserts. And these are only some pieces of the whole picture. Architecture, planning, and design all are acting as components of a process. And this process is sustaining a bigger malfunctioning system, which is creating all these inequalities.
One of these malfunctioning is happening in the community engagement process. The current process, as Negar shared in Little Jamaica, is neither inclusive nor meaningful. And when we look at it, some of its common flaws are so obvious. Firstly, although it is becoming mandatory to engage communities in development projects, when it comes to incorporating the community engagement, the ultimate goal is often to convince the community to agree with the project and proposed program. It stops at informing. Secondly, there is often no attempt to co-create with the community, and most of the time, the engagement ends at the consultation at its best. On one hand, public and community members lose trust to the process of community consultancy, as they don't see a meaningful outcome and co-benefit out of the public meeting sessions and see it as a waste of time. On the other hand, the design team lose their faith to the public consultancy process as is. There is often no budget allocated in their contract for the community engagement, and they have to absorb it somehow magically. Even in the most common setting, when a community engagement consultant is on board, the community usually ends up being just the big reports on the desk of architects. This process has no meaningful outcome when the community is not at the table from the start till the end. And this is how this broken process is losing its key players.
Okay, let's talk a bit about OACC journey. The members at OACC comes from different places in the world, and we have experienced similar flaws and issues in our practice. In this experience, we started to question our roles as design expert, and we came together because we realized that we need to act collectively to make change. And we all brought in our assets and expertise in architecture, planning, design to help move this collaborative forward. For myself, I'm an interior designer and a project manager with 10 years of experience. And with my passion for changing and challenging this inequitable design process, this was my major driver to incorporate OAC as a non-for-profit and gather people with the same passion under one umbrella to make it a collective effort. Afsana brought with her 9 years of experience in design and implementing community and recreational center project in Toronto and all over Canada to leverage our knowledge about the limitation and potential for architectural ecosystem in Canada and promote co-designing with community. Marva brought her experience as a designer and strategist in community-led projects, social innovation ecosystem to encourage our pivoting in our impact center practice. And Negar brought her experience in working with grassroots and her knowledge in urban design and public life study to explore innovative communities engagement approaches. Together with our core members and volunteers, we built a growing and colorful community of diverse experts and assets. And now as the representative of this growing community, we would like to share with you the story of our collective journey. So we started in 2003 as the Toronto chapter of Architecture for Community. Our approach was more about making good design accessible for underrepresented community and connecting our network of volunteer designers to local groups, as well as international organizations such as UN. We were looking for architect solution to their humanitarian design.
So Architecture for Humanity later rebranded itself as Open Architecture Collaborative, and we became the Toronto chapter and continued to operate on a volunteer basis. But along with this name change, we also shifted our mindset. Through our years of working for different communities, we learned that in order to find long-lasting solutions that work for everyone, we need to shift our approach to work with communities instead of working for communities. So we started supporting community organizations to engage their communities in projects for envisioning better neighborhoods. And one of these projects, which also led to another critical shift in our mindset, was a project called Expropriate 214 to 230 Sherbourne. In early 2019, Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, or OCAP for short, reached out to ask for our support in their campaign to call on the City of Toronto to expropriate a series of vacant lots on Sherbourne Street for building affordable housing. OCAP had been conducting this campaign long before we got involved in the project. A big rental property owner put up this property for sale in 2018, but when City Council considered purchasing it in response to a community mobilization, the owners took the property off of the market and made it clear that they would prefer to sell to condo developers. OCAP then attempted to pressure the city to look at options to expropriate the site, but the requests were denied. So OCAP then decided to get a team of designers on board, hoping that this would be a better way of convincing the city to buy this property. And this was when we got involved. In collaboration with OCAP and allied designers, we conducted 2 workshops with those people who were most affected by this housing issue. And we tried to engage them in envisioning an alternative development on the site. We then analyzed the responses to understand the design requirements and priorities, and we incorporated them into a speculative design. We also put together a formal report detailing this community engaged process, as well as the results of OCAP's comprehensive study of the housing crisis in the area. Afterwards, along with other grassroots and community members, we made a deputation at the Planning and Housing Committee and presented the report and the design. We also wrote an open letter to the Mayor John Tory and shared it with a broad network of academics and practitioners in architecture and planning to get their support. And this time, it worked. On December 2019, Council authorized the staff to initiate negotiations to acquire this property and to identify funding possibilities for this acquisition. But being involved in this project made it even more obvious for us that our good intention is not enough to solve complex issues such as this housing crisis. They're systemic and we need to approach them systemically. We also learned that if we want our action to be impactful, we need to act collectively with groups who might not traditionally be seen as stakeholders in development projects. And earlier this year, in a similar advocacy project in Little Jamaica, we also experienced firsthand that how critical it is to build trust in a collective action. And we also learned that it takes time to build this trust with communities who are already frustrated by tokenism. I earlier talked about how the Black business owners were excluded from the decision-making process. But fortunately, despite being largely excluded, when they learned that the recommendations of Eglinton Connect are already being implemented, they were eager to be part of this process moving forward. And also several local groups and organizations were already on the field mobilizing the community to influence the process. So when they reached out to us, we joined their collective effort to design and co-facilitate their engagement activities. We conducted 2 conversation sessions in collaboration with Black Urbanism Toronto and Buto for short and other allies to provide an opportunity for Black business owners to reflect on the Eglinton Connect's plan and also to share their own desires and ideas. But when we started the first session, we realized that none of our design activities or presentation materials are going to be useful. The local business owners, frustrated by their daily struggles to save their livelihood, were extremely suspicious about any outsider designer or planner who would ask for their precious time without offering them a tangible solution or a tangible outcome. And we realized that although we were closely collaborating with Buto, and although the local community had trust in Buto, but for the community, we were new faces with titles that are usually associated with the parties on the other side of the table. So we decided to sit back and just listen to business owners sharing their struggles and frustrations. And gradually a safer space was created, and then people started to brainstorm around the issues, the barriers, and possible solutions. And all the things that we learned and heard from the community in those 2 sessions and in many one-on-one conversations informed the development of a report called A Black Business Conversation. This report provides recommendations and illustrates the future that the Black community envisions for their neighborhood. And the good news is that this report and the future it envisions found its way through municipal government. And this September, the City of Toronto adopted a motion which is greatly informed by the recommendation of this report.
But as exciting as this news is, we have learned from our previous experience that a successful advocacy campaign is just a beginning. And if you want to ensure that our collective action is creating an actual impact, we have to stay involved in the project for a much longer time. And we realize that this long-term commitment requires us to pivot our strategy. That's why we transitioned from being a 100% volunteer-based organization to a self-sustained, impact-centered organization early this year. This pivot would enable us to maintain a long-term relationship with communities and projects, and also co-define the projects with communities from the very early stages up to the post-evaluation, where we measure the target impacts and monitor how well the project is working for the community. Having the vision of expanding our impact Canada-wide, we changed our name from Toronto to Canada this year to become an umbrella for the future chapters in all cities and provinces in Canada. One of our strategic approach to promote this impact-centric vision is to build communities around places, to co-create a foundation for communities to proactively engage in the processes that shape their public realms and neighborhoods. We offer workshops to grassroots and organizations who work at community level to meaningfully engage their community members in initiating projects. Our other strategy is to promote the impact-centric vision and community-based approach among the practitioners, as well as the students within the architecture and planning fields. We do offer training sessions, learning packages, and workshops. We all know that it takes time for the capacity to be built for the practitioners and fundamentally change the process. In the meanwhile, we need to interfere the process and act as a bridge between the practitioners and the community. Placing ourselves at the intersectionality of the two, we set our role as a strategic advisor to the practices, like architectural firms, to help them coming up with a vision on how to plan a project at the very early stage and advise the whole process to incorporate the multi-stakeholder approach with the community at center, responding to the project's timeline, resources, and local context. We have also initiated a research and development lab to scale up the social innovation in our sector and to explore more meaningful participatory approaches. We conduct participatory research to evaluate how the existing spaces and facilities work for the community from the impact and equity perspective. And we use the outcome to build evidence for advocacy cases. As you see, our work is all about co-creation. We are looking forward to hear from individuals and community groups who are willing to ideate and develop project ideas around the well-being of their communities.
So what we shared was just a small window to this reality that we need to change the role and process of design and planning of our built environment. And opportunities like this discussion panel can create that momentum that needed for collectively and critically thinking and hopefully acting about it on the community of practices, perhaps. So thank you so much for listening to our story and our reflections. And now I pass the torch to you, Heather, to start our discussion.
Thank you so much. Before I do that, though, I want to go back to that picture. And I went through all the responses, and there were 5, I'm going to say words that I was able to harvest from that. And amenities, activities, lots happening, nature, people, and animals. So some of those are key words, but I do want to highlight some comments. So it was like inclusion. Everyone can use the space. I love this one. Another day at the local park. Togetherness and separation. So much going on. Disconnection among people, but connection with animals. Caring for the vulnerable, observers, and doers. So as you can see, one space has many different thoughts and ideas. It depends on your view and your lens that you put on to a picture or to a park or to an amenity. So thank you very much. Thank you everybody for contributing to this. So we're going to move on to the next part of this, and in our practice with the panel, it was a very lively discussion. And so I hope that you're going to enjoy it as much as I did the first round, and I think the second round is always better. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. Zahara Abraham is a public interest designer and strategist focusing on shifting power to people who are typically underrepresented in institutions and systems. Her work has focused on deep community-led approaches to policy, infrastructure, and service design. Do you want to just give a wave? Next, we have Paul Young, who's a health promoter and planner in Toronto, who provides promotes walking and cycling throughout Ontario with a company called Public Space Workshop. He's been working in urban design and shaping the built environment for over 20 years. Hi, Paul. And we have Dean Murdoch. He is a former 3-term municipal councillor for the district of how do we pronounce that?
Saanich.
Saanich. I always mess that up. In the BC Capital Region. He hosts a podcast, which I have listened to several of them, so I will make sure you all get the link to it, on building, community building and placemaking called Amazing Places. So welcome everybody, and we're going to get started with the panel.
Awesome. So for sure, we're going to have an exciting dynamic discussion. So can you share again the slideshow, Afternoon?
While that's happening, just making sure that you can also put your questions in the question and answer box as we go through this, and I'll make sure that I bring your questions into this conversation.
Okay, let's go to the next slide then for the start. Awesome. So I just want to get us started by giving you a quick overview of the discussion scenario. So we will talk around 3 levels of system change. And as you can see in the slide, we will start from the macro level, which would be the individual practices. And then we will move forward to the meso level, and we will explore how we can connect the dots, create synergies between small changes for a collective action. And finally, we would go to the macro level, exploring large system changes, how the whole ecosystem of planning, design, and development could or should be accountable for an inclusive process, as well as for their impact on communities. Can we go to the next? Okay, so let's start with your individual experiences. The question is, how do you take into account the impact that your project, your practice would actually create in a target community? And from this perspective, how community stakeholders influence your project or your practice? We hear a lot about social acceptance of projects, and even in business, it is called license to operate. And this social acceptance requires developing dialogue with all community stakeholders. So what does this mean for your practice? Why and how do you initiate this dialogue, and at what stage of your project? So Paul, do you want to start?
Sure. Took me a second to unmute. Well, I think you've talked about the importance of engaging the community, and from your examples, the importance of documenting some of that engagement and putting it into a form that I think a lot of this is about language and who is going to be receiving the consultation that you're doing. So in some of the examples you shared, your collective work was going to the planning department. So it looked like you put the results of that work into language that planners could take and use. So, you gave form to the buildings, you looked at the neighborhood and did sort of a macro analysis. But all that work, I mean, I've been to a number of consultations where we never get to the language of the planner. We talk in sort of broad terms about livability and greening, etc. But I think in order for those things to have an impact, it needs to be almost translated into the language that the receiver is going to need to hear. So zoning and building envelope and setbacks and all that sort of nuts and bolts that you seem to include there. And then from there, you can get into specifics around design. I'm happy to open it up to others too.
So you have shared with us some of slides about your projects. Do you want to elaborate on that? I mean, we have the
sure,
slides
yeah.
here.
If you want,
Can you have fun and go further so we can?
Yeah. So this is we had done a couple of planning studies that looked at how to connect people into a valley trail system. This is the Don Valley Trail in Toronto, and recognizing there are a number of high-rise housing projects along the river, and people don't have access to green space. So the valley becomes really important. It was a kind of a junky dumping ground for many years, but now it's emerging as an important green space asset, especially now during COVID when people want to get out and use trails. In the planning studies, the community had identified the need to connect into the valley and make some accessible connections. So connections that could be used with a stroller or a wheelchair. And the consultants and the city were, I don't want to say stonewalling, but they basically said it wasn't feasible to put a ramp in. So I draw on this history of planning and technical aid. I mean, it seems to be more popular in the UK, where architects, designers can assist the community and almost become a tool of the community. So I provided information on how to figure out the slopes of the ramp, and we went out and measured the distance it had to go, and etc. And then I explained, this could be as simple as a Photoshop on an aerial photo. And anyway, so someone took that on. They didn't have any architectural background or experience, but they were kind of computer savvy. And they put together this little report saying, it looks like a ramp is feasible, and it's a very, what you see is kind of a crude design, but it was more just to demonstrate that this is a feasible thing, and it, of course, so that resulted in the city issuing an RFP, or a request for proposals to design and cost out a ramp. So that is ongoing. We're still waiting. Then COVID hit and budgets were frozen. So, but this was more of an exercise in allowing the community to take this idea forward with some assistance.
Thank you so much for sharing. So I just want to ask Zahra to take the turn, and specifically because you have the more interdisciplinary practice, you might even have some strong comments of the social acceptance. So just feel free to share with us your experience and specifically about this kind of language.
Yeah, I always have strong comments about everything. No, but this has been so useful, and it's so great to just as context for some of you that I might not have mentioned on our prep call. I was part of the original Architecture for Humanity volunteer group back in the early 2000s, and it helped with a lot of that organizing and trying to integrate a lot of the language that you've so successfully done. At a time where I think that the architecture community still felt that community practice was not legitimate architectural practice. And when I'm just listening and hearing sort of how we've normalized this, at least in, for the 93 people on this call, I think that it's becoming more normalized. And I think that's part of sort of my response to the question, which is, an impact-centered approach to my practice has been my practice. I'm not a trained or a licensed architect. I studied architecture and design, but I'm not a licensed architect or planner. But my work is about engaging communities in infrastructure, policy development, service development, that is sort of germane to their success and their ability to thrive and be resilient. And so the work Thank you, Paul Dowsett. Community practice is legitimate. Thank you. He knows he will be weighing in a lot, I'm sure, in this conversation. And, you know, I think my practice has really been about how do we as professionals, and I'm counting myself for a minute in the community of those who identify as capital P professionals, how do we as professionals transfer the useful parts of our practice? And I say that because I'm sitting beside a book from the Canadian Housing Design Council that's sitting on my desk that talks about teaching architects and planners how to build the cookie cutter approach to design and housing. So the useful parts of our practice, how do we transfer that knowledge to communities so that they can have better literacy and capacity to engage in these processes proactively? And I think, you know, I've shared a lot of great examples through some writing around communities like St. Jamestown that proactively do what some people would call visioning, but a lot of other people would call social planning and planning for their neighborhoods and communities. And that way, you know, planners from the city can actually engage with that as the primary point of contact versus on a project to project basis. So what I would say is, you know, at the output of a community driven process where communities from the start are articulating what they want, are literate enough to engage with the sort of planners and social development and all those folks within municipalities, what you get at the end is not a spectacle, right? It's a different kind of monument in our cities. It's a different kind of monumentality in our cities, which is sort of the everyday, like expressions of the needs of, you know, residents in their everyday lives. And it's not always beautiful and thoughtful and wallpaper magazine worthy. It's just, it really meets a need. And it does so very thoughtfully, not unlike what Paul just shared. I mean, not to say that wasn't beautiful, it was super beautiful. but it meets the needs, right? And that is, to me, the architectural expression, you know, of community design. Not to say it's mutually exclusive of aesthetics and beauty, but that's not the primary outcome. And then the only other thing I'll just say, because I could talk for an hour, but I am respectful of my wonderful co-panelists, is I'll just say one more thing, which is, you know, I think that in the context of COVID, which is where we started this conversation and looking at how the pandemic has shifted perspectives on community engagement, I think it's been really interesting, and it's always been central to my practice, and I think the practice of my peers here on this call. But I think it's been really central to our practice, that sort of notion, the Lila Watson quote about, you know, if you come here to save me, you're wasting your time. But if you come here because you recognize that, you know, your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. I think during COVID, we've seen that our liberation is bound, right? And so there should not be a distinction between architectural and planning practice and community practice. Like, we are building buildings for residents who live in places, like that should be integrated. And we've seen that the lack of integration and calling it community design practice versus architecture is actually part of the problem that got us here. And I say this broadly, policy and community engagement, you know, it's not just architects and planners, and I don't mean to point a finger at all. I for sure am complicit in it myself. But I just think that that's always, for anyone who does community design, we do it not as an act of charity, we do it as an act of solidarity, because we believe in that shared liberation. And part of, you know, my practice is making sure that's integrated. And I think the world has actually started to shift to see that solidarity lens. And I'm really optimistic at what I'm hearing from this group and you know, the chatter and in the audience. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean that was awesome. Like, yeah, I mean, that solidarity. I mean, yeah, awesome. So let's go to Dean, and then you are sitting in a place of, you know, seeing that big picture, but from your own experience as I mean, someone sitting at the decision making of policy, but your individual experience regarding this impact centered or community engaged practice. So I mean, what is your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'll just start by acknowledging, because I'm out on the West Coast, that I'm on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples on the Saanich Peninsula of the southern Vancouver Island. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of the panel. I thought a lot about how an example I might be able to draw on from my experience as an elected official, a former elected official on a municipal council. And one actually came to me just very recently. As Heather mentioned, I host a podcast called Amazing Places. And yesterday had an interview with the mayor of Victoria. And she pointed out this fantastic program that the city offers called Neighbourhood grants. And they're just small micro grants up to $5,000. Communities, neighborhoods can apply to undertake any kind of project that is positioned around placemaking, trying to create a more community-centered place. And so, as you might expect, this runs the gamut in terms of the kinds of applications they receive. Because it's not about infrastructure, it's about creating a place for people to gather. And in this period, that becomes a little more challenging, but there's certainly outdoor spaces, places of interest. And the reason I wanted to share this example, because I think it's so indicative of an impact-centered approach. Rather than the municipality, they still do determine priorities as part of their annual budget process and infrastructure plans. But rather than taking an approach where they'll go to the community and explain or describe the kind.
Oh no, I think.
What is it?
Yeah.
Oh, Dean, you froze.
Oh, sorry. Oh no.
No, you came back.
I'm back. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Rather than dictating to the community what that amenity or that contribution ought to look like, they open it up. They welcome the opportunity for neighbors to come together with a plan, whether that's a park bench or a mural or some kind of small community improvement that really becomes a people place that attracts people to that to gather around it in that location and really celebrate what's great about their neighborhood. And I think that this is such a low cost, low barrier way of allowing people to take ownership of the communities where they live, creating that sense of place in their own neighborhoods, making the improvements that neighbors have discussed. That wouldn't it be great if we were able to create this space or take better advantage of this space that exists. So I just wanted to offer that one as a way that local governments can kind of turn the conversation around. Rather than just relying on that broader strategic planning, infrastructure investment, annual budgets, your parks, trails, and rec master plan, allowing neighbors to really have a stake in what their neighborhood is going to look like, and just offering a small amount of funding in order to make that happen. And it gets the ball rolling. It will often turn into a much larger initiative that's almost entirely volunteer resource based. And it really creates that sense of place for community. So in my view, I think that has a tremendous impact and really kind of just by its nature stays true to those folks who are going to be most impacted by what goes on there.
Thanks, Dean. I'm going to actually jump in here. Because I have been listening to all, and I just wanted to summarize what we've been hearing. That trust in relationships and building that trust and taking the time for relationships. I heard theory into practice. So translating that knowledge. It's great having that theory, that cookie cutter, but how do you actually make it happen? And I also heard about the solidarity, but I'm using a different language, is silos, right? So we all are in our silo, whether it's our silo of our sector or the division that we work in. It's connecting the silos because we all have a purpose. And the reason why we're architects, the reason why we're planners, the reason why we're community developers, we all have a function to do to build community, but we need to connect each other and work with each other to create it. And Dean hit on something that I absolutely love is celebrate. And celebrate what is strong in our community and how do you build on that. And then the last piece is the language piece. And all of us have different languages that we use. And, engagement means something different to all of us, depends on where we come from, what sector we come from, the knowledge we have. And so being very clear on the language and being able to translate that to whoever it is that you're talking with. So those are the kind of the summaries I heard from this conversation. And I thought I'd just do that before we move on.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for this. And we will have actually one discussion panel focusing on this connecting these dots or silos. So it's a great actual momentum for that question. So let's go to the next one. After up to you.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for sharing. Here we kind of going back to that practice and the barriers that we face in our practices, like common barriers like time frames, budget, client resistance towards what the changes or unconventional approaches that we want to have. So it'll be great if you guys, each of you, can share with us that how do you deal with barriers to put community and impact at the forefront of your practices. So I think on this one, maybe I rephrase also my question, or better ask, how do you turn these barriers to opportunities and find unconventional channels to pitch it to the client? And actually, it'll be great if you can also touch on the pandemic situation and the opportunities and barriers that it brings with it in this context. I'll ask Zara to start with this, answering this question.
Beautiful, thank you. And I really do appreciate all the other comments, Dean. I think the microgrants is a transformative way to get things moving and starting. There's tons of examples here. I chair a board of an organization called Park People, and we deliver microgrants to, we're a national organization delivering microgrants in parks and communities. And we see so much change seeded through, $500,000 grants, like, really modest amounts. It's interesting. I was thinking about the piece on language that Paul brought up at the start of the conversation, and that's been a real sticking point for me in how we do this work, because I think part of how we de-risk some of this work is starting off by building shared language, so there isn't censorship down the road, so there isn't misinterpretation, so there isn't what's the other word? Oh, there isn't, mishaps in analysis when we get data from communities and then someone else whose lens is very different interprets it as it wasn't meant to be interpreted. So the shared language piece is first and foremost, at the start of our process, any process we do. And actually a colleague of ours who's not on the call, but Paul, who spoke up, was part of that process, talks about how social development and community development work and planning actually is very similar, just using different languages. So that's, part of it is really integrating that. I think the other thing that, seems radical for planners and architects, but I think is really important, is when you think of your business development cycle, right? Getting new projects, responding to RFPs. Do you think about engaging community organizations in that stage? So when you have a little bit of time in between projects and you're looking for new clients and you're looking for new partners and you're talking to the city and you're doing all the things you do when you have like just a hair of time, do you think about, building relationships with great community organizations that you can co-pitch projects with? So something I've done over the course of my career in a variety of organizations that I've led and worked at has been to go in on, pitching the project together versus bringing in a community organization at some discounted rate later down the road, going in as co-collaborators and co-creators from the start. I think that really changes the nature of how institutions liaise with the project and liaise with engagement practitioners or planning professionals, which to me sort of changes the mental model. And that also is related to what I see here in very small print on budget, which is something that I've been really adamant about. Is one of the things that I think is really important in doing better engagement, consultation, and co-design. And these are all, assuming we have to still do engagement and consultation the way that we do. To me, I have been, and for those of you from different municipalities, I would love to hear how this works in your jurisdictions. But one of the things that I've been really excited about was an example out of San Francisco, where for their, I believe for their regional transit plan, instead of getting engagement practitioners and professional planning firms and architecture firms who sort of do consultation, having the vendor of record list for the community dialogue and sort of leading the conversations be community organizations. So ahead of time, what they did was they started to go talk to community organizations, figure out their sort of needs around capacity to be able to lead and facilitate community dialogue about design and planning and infrastructure, and then have them be the vendors of record for engagement. So they pitch to lead the engagement. And then when it comes to budget, you're not like slicing out a tiny little bit of, your design budget, but really that engagement budget goes directly to them and they lead that. And they sort of build relationships with planners and architects through the process. And just the last thing I'll say on that is, this is my big piece is, and I've done this and I'm starting to transition my practice away from it, which is, we do an engagement or a consultation, then we scurry away and we make it, legible to planners, legible to city officials, all those different things. I think analysis is actually where we see a lot of discrimination and a lot of sort of, and I have tons of examples of well-meaning planners and consultations, documenting incidences of racism as someone was upset, versus I experienced racism, in this system, in this public system, whatever. So I think for me, one of the key parts of our practice in sort of overcoming barriers is, shared language at the start, but collaborative analysis of anything that comes out of a consultation or engagement process.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you, Zahra. And I want to bring up that project of you, the East Scarborough storefront project that, when I was reading through it, the way that you build capacity and help the youth to come up with the actual project for me was a very good example of working with community and try to make the most out of the budget that you had to do that process. So that was a great project and good, prototype for everyone to look at. By that, I would ask Dean to jump in and talk about how you deal with the barriers in your field.
Thanks. Zara, I really appreciated the examples that you provided there. Mine is going to be quite different, but it really kind of inspired me in thinking about the role that planners and engineers play in terms of how these projects unfold and their interrelationship with the community. So I was thinking about exactly that. I mean, from a local government perspective, you try to run a tight ship. You look at trying to set your annual budget, you set your priorities, and then work begins as part of that long planned process. And there are clear deliverables. There are clear infrastructure outcomes or key pieces that will be delivered that are expectations as part of that process. When that runs up against the idea of how communities want to see things take place, it can become very challenging for locally elected officials, for mayor and council, who want to be responsive to what they're hearing from communities. While at the same time, there are preset expectations about how things are going to be delivered, when they're going to be delivered, and what that's going to look like when it's finished. And I think that disrupting that practice as usual has been about the notion of surrender, to try and relax some of those expectations around what something's going to be when it's finished, and handing that process over to community to really be the architects, the designers of what that will be for them, how it will be meaningful when it's introduced into the environment that they live and breathe every day, versus some preconceived idea of what an infrastructure project or some other kind of community amenity will mean when it's finished on time and on budget. This pandemic, I think, COVID, the response to COVID and the impacts that it's had on community and businesses has really been telling in terms of disrupting that practice as usual. Rather than having your elected officials say that we're going to do these things this year, the conversation has really turned around to how can we help? What are the things that we can do that's going to help support local businesses to stay in place, that's going to open up public spaces so that communities have safe places to gather when they can't get together inside, or from an equity perspective, they don't have the real estate, they don't have the private property in which to invite people into their private spaces. And so opening up those public spaces to make that available for everyone's use. I think that we've seen this pandemic teach us some really valuable lessons about how municipalities, how local governments can use their resources to enable those kinds of changes that support community, that support businesses. You look at the creation of these patios, for example, that used to be sidewalks or parking spaces for cars that were almost overnight transformed into spaces that those businesses could use so that their customers could come and enjoy that space, enjoy each other's company in a safe environment. Here in Greater Victoria, there's an example where there was even live music. They shut down an entire street, created a patio for a very popular local restaurant. And there was even live music out on the street in a place that used to be dominated by vehicles. And it was all done just for the sake of supporting those businesses and, importantly, creating those public spaces for people to congregate. So I think it shows us that local governments are capable, they are in a position to be able to change the way that they undertake these kinds of initiatives, that they can be responsive, they can still be fiscally disciplined, they can still meet timelines, but using the resources that are available to them in terms of staff and funding in order to make these changes to better support community. And they do that first by listening, by starting the conversation with, how can we help? And then finding a way to make it happen.
Thanks, Dean. You brought up some very good points. One was expectation to be on time and on budget from the perspective of the municipality, which is totally understandable. And also, you brought up disrupting the practice as usual. So I just want to briefly touch on an example here in downtown Toronto that I was witnessing as one of our projects in my previous architectural firm, and that is a Moss Park revitalization project. So it was started with that notion of expectation to be on time and on budget. It started in 2015 with the consultation, public consultation process, and then the project awarded to the design team in 2016 with a set budget and a project brief. And then after 2 years of designing, creative design, and to meet the project brief, it went on hold. And then the second round started with asking, is it really feasible to go with that project brief? So let's do some feasibility studies and come up with some other ideas. And again, it went on hold after a while. And then I just realized that it'll go on procurement for design team and community consultant in winter of 2020. So 5 years passed with the notion, and it started with the notion that we want to finish it on budget and on time, but going through that community consultancy, they realized what they had in mind in the first place would not work at all. And they reached to the point that if at the very start, they put that time to do it with the community, they wouldn't, lose that much of time and budget and human resources in the first place. and could define the project with the community and what they want. So that's what you mention it as interfering the practice as usual, and for the municipality and the client to have the mindset that sometimes even it's more feasible when you do it with, and always actually it's more feasible when you do it with the community and get their ideas, because that's with the answer with what they really need and desire to have. So with that, I would turn it to Paul to also talk about some of these barriers and how he deals with them.
Thanks, Afsana. I too was looking at the Moss Park and the history of that, and I thought in the earlier conversations about Zara, you talked about the RFP process, and I think that one in particular seemed to put a fair bit of emphasis on the engagement process, and the first iteration was with a community agency as the lead, I believe, for 519 Community Center, which was kind of refreshing to see. And I think it points to the need for at the very beginning in the RFP to set out the expectations around the engagement process clearly, and put in the wording that states you want a meaningful engagement process, and it's part of the budget. And I think that would go a long way to improving the engagement on all sorts of projects. The example that I had is a few years ago was the Gardner East demolition and Lakeshore Boulevard redesign, and we were the landscape architects on that. It started off as a maintenance project, so the limitations here were the scope. It was, do we remove it or do we repair it? That was the scope. And then and then there was a group in the beaches area that organized to keep it. They wanted to, rebuild it, and even though it was mostly a useless piece of old infrastructure, and that the city and the local elected representatives realized they needed a better engagement process. But I think the point here is that we have legally required engagement processes connected to environmental assessments, to rezonings, and we just need to make them better. And in this case, they ramped up the engagement mid-project and said, we need to talk about a bigger picture here, because the community was asking, what about this huge right-of-way that's going to be left over? Shouldn't we be planting trees and adding a recreational path instead of selling it off to the nearby film studios? So the community asking that question, it makes it much easier when you have a professional engagement person at the front of the team, and not, in this case, the lead was an engineering company, and their engagement process or experience was not that sophisticated. So in this case, the community used the engagement process to leverage. It wasn't a huge increase in budget, given the overall cost of this project, to add the amenities that you see in front of you. Very minimal. I think it was like 3% increase in cost. But I think the question many of you may be thinking about is who pays for these more progressive engagement processes. Like, that's not usually part of a project budget. How are we going to get that to happen? Personally, I'm employed by a community health center, and community health centers exist all across the country. And part of their mandate is to engage the community in local issues. So that's just one example. There are others, I think, of legal aid, where a percentage of fees from the legal profession go towards legal aid centers. So people can access those services that may not have the budget to pay for it. The OALA, the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects, has a program called Sprout. I don't know how sustainable it is, but it was initiated by members that wanted to provide services to communities that might not be able to afford them. So and I guess that question of where do we find the money to do this? There are a number of places, and an example I have in front of you is just taking an environmental assessment and saying, we want the process to be meaningful. It's a required part of this project, so let's do it well. I don't know if I put any other slides in there.
Yes, I actually, it's up there, the gardener one, but no,
Yes.
I didn't. Oh yeah,
So that's
one.
the end result. They had to do a drawing to show people what was possible. And that too is important in engagement, is, to open up the scope and say, no, this doesn't have to be just a maintenance project. There are other opportunities here, and we don't need to be bound by the scope necessarily, if we can have that open, transparent conversation. And I think, Dean, to your point about letting go of the end design, in this case, the community recognized there was a huge opportunity here. The councillor was fairly forward thinking. It was Jack Layton at the time, who had a pretty good understanding of public engagement. And the scope was widened, and now it's part of the trail system in Toronto. It's a linear park.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. So I will hand it to Marve to continue with the question.
I'm just going to jump in and just do a recap. So what we heard from the panelists in that question was about, and I love this, engagement happens all the time. And so even in between projects to be doing engagement, but I also added what Paul just said, that engagement needs to happen in the RFP process too, and being very clear about your engagement. And I love the concept of collaborative analysis. Dean brought in about the process, and I wrote process versus community wants. And how do we find this middle ground where we still have to abide by and meet our processes, but bringing in the community wants into the conversation. And it made me think about an exercise called the different hats. And what we did was we brought all the players around the table to a development plan, and even residents, a mom with a baby, and we had planners and engineers and architects, and they all brought their hats to the table, and it allowed everyone to understand the perspective of what they look at when they're looking at a plan. And then it actually built relationships and trust in the process. And so that exercise that we did about 7 years ago. And then the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And when you're doing that engagement piece, you're helping those people to understand the scope of the work, and reducing the pushback, the barrier to the work. And then lastly, what Paul said about looking for other opportunities, and what COVID has brought to us is this amazing question: how might we ... So that's what I heard.
Thank you so much, Heather, for recap. And now we will go to that collective action that previously brought up. We want to explore how we can go beyond these individual changes or individual initiatives that we have for a more collective action. What would it take to create this collective action for the system change? And by system here, I'm referring to that system of decisions that shape the built environment. So I'll pass the torch to Dean to start the conversation.
Thank you. I think this is an interesting one, and it's one where I'm going to draw on my professional work. I work for the provincial government here in British Columbia as the provincial lead for healthy communities. And this sort of integrative approach is really one that we're keen to inspire in terms of working in the community settings. And we work with a nonprofit called BC Healthy Communities, which runs a program called Plan H. And they are very keen on this cross-sector work. And so what the approach that they've undertaken is really about how you frame the discussion, the kind of language you use in order to bring multi-sector partners to the table. From a health perspective, when you start conversations, particularly in the community setting with local governments, talking about health, for the most part, those folks are going to check out. Health is not on the agenda at least in the traditional way of understanding health services, when you think physicians and hospitals, that's not something local governments are particularly interested in talking about. If you reframe it more in thinking in terms of well-being and a happier, healthier, more productive, socially connected population, those are some of the key things that really drive decision makers and really speak to planners and engineers. It also, using the language around equity and addressing some of the social determinants of health, looking at things like poverty as major contributing factors to why we experience the kinds of population health outcomes that we do, allows you to begin to shift to talk about things like infrastructure and talking about the built environment, understanding some of the infrastructure deficits that some of our communities suffer as a result of underspending and underinvestment in those areas. And so looking at ways to bring those that sector into the conversation. I have partners who work for transportation who are interested in the idea of active transportation. And for them, poverty and access are major barriers to participation in active transportation. And yet we can have a conversation from a health perspective with those partners because we are addressing some of those barriers. We're looking at the social determinants of health, the environmental determinants of health, and some of those things that prevent people from being active participants just by nature of the neighborhood in which they live or the incomes that they have that prevent them from buying a bike or buying a scooter, or there's a lack of proper infrastructure in their neighborhood that allows them to get out and walk in their communities. So I think it's a matter of how the language is framed. That's how we bring multi-sector partners together, is looking at it from bringing it up a level from what's the problem to addressing it in terms of those barriers or things that may inhibit folks from being active participants at the table. So I think if you can take an example from healthy communities and the idea of health promotion and public health, it's re-examining or re-evaluating the language that's used in order to build those cross-sector partnerships.
That great point, actually, Dean, about this reframing. The way we are putting forward this conversation, reframing in kind of a shared language, and I have a kind of reflection on this from our own perspective in OACC, and our sector, design and planning, still we are not so familiar with that kind of impact center language. And I think when it comes to talking with other sectors, when it comes to talking with foundations or philanthropies or other impact centered activities or initiatives, we really lag behind those sectors to convey our roles in this this collective action. And the other point also is about both having this language, shared language, and also shared resources, because there are lots of resources in other sectors, like for example in real estate, amazing resources that they can support. Financially, they can support this social cost of other way of doing another way of building our built environment. Paul, you mentioned about that. Who's going to pay that? So why not these kind of corporate social responsibility initiatives in our real estate part, and so that they become part of this conversation for a collective impact. I guess perhaps Zahra, you can comment on some of this and your thoughts.
Sure, and I noticed that we don't have a ton of time left, so I'll try and keep it short so we can get to questions. I just want to co-sign everything Dean said, because I think that's it, right? It's this integrated social determinants approach to engaging communities versus it's hard for any of us, even those of us who think about this all the time. It's hard to conceive of a project, a development, a built environment intervention and its implications on your life when you're just looking at it for the first time at the end of a tired day, at the end of a long day. So I think that the idea that we start to, and sort of building on what Dean was saying, the idea that we start to integrate how we engage from a whole life perspective. So looking at, and this is something I've seen during COVID, and I've seen in the city of Toronto at the very least, which is maybe it's because of consultation budgets or Zoom fatigue or whatever. Departments are integrating their consultations and engagement. So public health and city planning are kind of engaging together. Maybe I'm hoping there's like a ton of intentionality behind it, but even if it's accidental, it's better. So that kind of sort of integrated engagement where we say, like, what do you want from your life? What do you want your life to look like in your neighborhood, in your community? How do you want to connect? What does, outside of your front door, outside of the door of your building, wherever it is that you live in a community, what does that look like walking from there to your place of work, getting to your place of work? And then extrapolating for different departments or different parts of, a municipality, the information that they might most need. I want to just quickly touch on the comment, I think it was Miriam made, I'm just looking now, Miriam, about, we've talked a lot about municipalities, and I just want to touch on private development for a second, which is, I think there are things we can put in place to incentivize better practices. We've seen some of the more progressive developers like West Bank and dare I say Sidewalk Labs, try to think about doing this out of the chicken soup for the soul sort of approach, which is like, this is the right thing to do. But putting in sort of practices like, and I've written down a few ideas, in Toronto, developers in some cases run their own consultations, having guidelines in those agreements around what those consultations and engagements look like. When we do engagement, when anyone does engagement with residents in a city, providing dual contracts. So a lot of community organizations say we leverage our social capital to get people out. No one ever tells us what of our ideas got implemented. So having dual contracts where there is a commitment to implement some of the community ideas and a commitment to keep them engaged and informed throughout the process. And then the last thing I'll just say, which is, I think, super boring, but I think there's a world where this starts to institutionalize better practices, obviously social procurement. And, if we think about who's developing and who's engaging and what sorts of nonprofits are given contracts with the city, I think if we start to think about social procurement in a more nuanced way, that elevates the conversation for architects and planners and organizations to have to think about some of these principles. If it is that you have to partner with a community organization when you go in, that's led by folks who represent the population you're going to be serving, I think that starts to shift the conversation.
Thank you, Zara, for sharing your thoughts. And Paul, do you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, sure. I'm just looking at the comments, and Jillian mentioned the fact that we used to have funding from the Ministry of Health for what we call community development, basically bringing people together to collectively determine, take control over things that are going on in the community, with an eye to the determinants of health. So, which includes housing and poverty and all these health-related things. I guess the example I was going to share, I've done quite a bit of work with public health units across Ontario, and they really seem to be pushing the notion, and in fact they're mandated to organize communities to determine, to a certain extent, how to bring determinants under their own control. Like how do we collectively work towards improving our health and improving the conditions that support health. So, for example, access to transit. The project that I was going to share here is about walkability, which I think, Dean, to your point, nobody wants to come out and talk about health. And I think they framed this as a group, Walk On, which Heather was a part of years ago. So Walk On, the whole idea was, how do we improve walkability in your community? So pretty simple idea, but it gets at all these things like having diverse places to shop, having schools and workplaces within walking distance. It's all this challenging the status quo around urban sprawl, but it's all wrapped up in this nice little term, walkability. How would you improve it? And they created this pretty low threshold self-guided walking analysis. And so you could pick up this form from Niagara Region Public Health, and fill it out and mail it in. And the beauty of it was that would then go to the counselor. So the counselor would then have a collated collection of what the community is saying about walkability in the neighborhood. So I thought it was kind of a cool way of, really engaging people at a fairly straightforward, and it gets at some of these things like livability and certainly at issues around equity. We got into things like safe routes to school, safe routes for seniors. How do people who are living in nonprofit housing access transportation? Should we have transit routes that serve these communities better? All sorts of things, big box retail, on and on. So it was I just thought that was kind of a cool example of they used walkability as a nice, simple entry point into this discussion and a simple tool to empower people in getting engaged. And of course, you can then collect names and then put a little workshop together and say, hey, would you like to come to a workshop? And the whole idea of the workshop was to start an advisory committee. So ultimately, in Niagara region, there are now 12 community advisory committees around walkability and active transportation, which is a fairly interesting idea if you're looking at generating political support for walkability. And on top of that, they bring the 12 groups together. I don't know if it's once every year or two to collectively strategize on how to make the region more walkable and livable. So that was a really interesting kind of grassroots, and public health took a kind of a back seat. They orchestrated the whole process, but they just kind of stepped back and let the community take over. There's some minimal support around facilitation, how to run a meeting, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's kind of magic. And I think, we know as practitioners, there's many different ways to engage people. I think the key question in this, and we can be doing surveys, workshops, tours, all sorts of stuff. But really it's important to ask why, like, why are we doing this? And to be clear with the community or whoever it is you're working with, what's the point of this engagement process? What's up for discussion, what isn't? Just getting at that whole, trying to define what meaningful engagement is, because so many people have gone to public meetings in classes I've taught, groups that I've spoken to, and it's a miserable experience, right? The typical engagement process is like, oh my God, why would you ever want to go to that? So I think it's on us to decide, okay, why are we doing this and how do we do it in a meaningful way and bring more people in?
To build off what you just talked about, Paul, it was the walk on. It was really about citizen empowerment and that advocacy piece. And that, right now we are having an issue with the lack of civic engagement. And so this was really trying to build that and really get residents and citizens involved in community life and the decisions that happen in community. And then just looking at systems change too. One way is the young professionals that are coming out, looking at the courses and engagement, how they learn about engagement. Is it the traditional checklist that's been for years and years and years, and updating the engagement process within the different sectors. And I just want to touch upon Miriam's comment there. There are a couple private companies, private developers, one in Calgary and one in Baden, Ontario, that they don't just focus on building homes, they focus on building community with those homes. And so it really comes to sharing those stories. And in a post email, I will make connections to those two companies. And before the buildings are even done, the community's already built. Everybody knows who's moving in. They have a barbecue and a street party, and it's building that sense of community while building the buildings.
So Heather, I guess we are behind the time, so we have 2 more questions, but we should actually pass them. And if there's a questions, I think it's better to go to the questions.
So there are some questions. One goes to the City of Toronto Parks Department has recently reshifted their RFP process to 3 streams. So a planning and design, engagement strategy, and communication strategy. And they were just wanting to know what the panelists' thoughts are on whether or not this will improve the outcomes of RFP. I don't know, Paul and Zara, because you're based in Toronto.
I'm just trying to find the question. Sorry, I was listening.
That's in the Q&A box. It's been sitting in there for a while. It's from Jillian. No, not Jillian.
I'll just quickly jump in and say, yeah, I think it's a start. I think that there's a pretty amazing team right now at the City of Toronto Parks and Rec. And, you know, a very dear friend who's thinking about engagement, working there and really understands this as sort of default practice. So I think it's the first step towards trying to sort of not just create this amalgam that people respond to and sort of where engagement is secondary, but really give it the importance and distinction that it deserves by, you know, highlighting for folks that this is as important as the design. And so I think it's hopeful for sure. It's a start.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Jeremy about more information about the panelists, and in the post email, I will make sure that you get the bios and links to the to everyone so that you can dive deeper afterwards. There's another question here about it's from Anne, and how addressing the determinants of health, and how can we expand these examples like walkability process that Paul talks about? So how can we bring in the determinants of health in the work? I don't know, Paul, you probably, or even Dean.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about very simple ideas initially, like a complete community and a complete street, in order to improve walkability. And in the complete community, we talk about diversity of housing so that we don't have all the single family detached here and all the apartment buildings over there, that there's a mix, there's a missing middle, all that stuff. I think the walkability is the entry point. Then we get into complete communities, complete streets. And that's a bit of a detailed discussion, but in those two pieces, complete street talks about equity. Who are streets built for? If you don't have a car, what does that mean for you? And those, you know, cars cost, what are they, $9,000 a year now? What does that mean in terms of rent? Or you know, if you have to have a car because your affordable housing is on the outside of town. So equity comes up all the time, and it's and determinants of health include access to housing, include access to transportation, healthy food. Is there a neighborhood? Are you living in a food desert? All that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And Dean, you talked about it in terms of well-being and health.
That's right. So I think for most people, they don't think naturally about things like social determinants of health. That's just not part of their vocabulary. But I think from an engagement perspective, as you know, consultants or professionals who are involved in doing this work with community, it's the act of listening and asking why, you know, understanding where people are coming from, what are the limitations, what's the reality of their lived experience, and all of those social determinants of health just start to bubble up to the surface. It becomes so abundantly clear why you're seeing constraints around people's active engagement or participation in the neighborhoods or communities where they live, and then unpacking that and, you know, understanding how we can address those things from a multi-sectoral perspective. So I don't think it needs to be framed around the social determinants of health. It's helpful to have that framework in the back of your mind, but all of those things will expose themselves as part of that active listening process that I think we're all responsible for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I recognize the time, and I know, Zara, you have to hop off. There's one last question, and I think this is a great question to end with, is, you know, COVID has really changed the way we do engage. Normally we do it in person, and we do these graffiti walls, and we do tables and conversation. And so I'll start with you, Zara, first. How are you going to change your engagement methods being virtually?
There's lots of ways to do great engagement over WhatsApp, which is one of my favorite tools, which I could talk for a long time about, but I'll say that there are a ton of digital tools that are really accessible for folks. residents all over our country who that allow them to give feedback on a question in real time on their terms. So that's one thing. I would say much smaller groups is another. I think, I think we have to make it work. But I also think this is a great opportunity for the train the trainer approach, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about, is how do we do sort of collaborative participatory ethnography and have community leaders in the conversations that they're having with different residents in their neighborhoods and places. Be asking the questions in sort of more intimate settings, but doing some of the engagement and consultation work that needs to be done as they're reaching out to folks to check in and see if they're okay. I'm struggling with the Zoom consultation sessions. They're tough. It's tough in the best of times. The only thing I will say is that it does. One of the things I've noticed is that folks who typically wouldn't speak will use the chat to weigh in and not be on video. And so there are some pros to it where it sort of gives people a platform without having them feel so exposed. But on the whole, I think scaling down, how many people are having the conversation is sort of the one takeaway tip I would offer.
Okay. All right. And I know you have to jump off, so thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll hang around for a couple more minutes and then.
Okay. Okay. Dean, do you want to hop in here about how to engage virtually?
I think, as Zara said, it is so, unfortunately, it can be quite limiting. My experience has been similar, that you do actually get to hear from people through the chat that you don't normally hear from. They're not among the more vocal folks who would be in the room at an open house or a community forum. The other process I've heard from folks like the Happy City, I had a conversation with someone from the Happy City, and they said that they're still going door to door to hand out information. They're not having those conversations in person, but they are making an effort to reach out to people who wouldn't maybe be on a Zoom platform, so that they can still have input into the process. But unfortunately, I think we're all just trying to figure out the best way to work under the circumstances. It would be far better to have the opportunity to do it in person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Any last words of wisdom, Paul?
Not really. I mean, I think a lot of people find in-person meetings challenging too. Like, it's intimidating to grab a microphone. So this is pushing us to use some digital technologies, explore some other options. And I think the in-person meeting is going to come back. But right now, I think it's important I'm looking forward to trying breakout rooms. I haven't done it yet, but yeah. Let's use some of the stuff that we have, and it makes it easier. People can stay at home, and not everyone can get out to an evening meeting or a workshop. So
I'd actually have to say that the fact that you could do it from your home and not have to get in your car, especially in wintertime, and drive somewhere at 7 o'clock at night, it has opened the doors to a variety of people to be able to participate in that. So there's a few more questions, and what I'll do is I will harvest those questions that we didn't get to and put it out to the panelists if you have any ideas or thoughts you want to contribute, and we'll put it in a post email out to everyone, along with the bios, and we actually talked a lot of great tools and stories. So it's going to be a pretty awesome email, post email. That'll be loaded with resources to come along with the recording. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. This was the longest webinar I've done, and I thought, oh, we're never going to go over, and we did. So doesn't mean having more time means you're going to actually end on time. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon, morning, wherever you are, and stay healthy.